going to do a talk called Canopy Walk through single-page applications. Now, I guess that most of you are familiar with what a single-page application is. Hands up if you're not. Fantastic. Lovely. I can skip half my slides. Thank you for saving me 20 minutes. All right, so what is a single-page app? We can skip all of that. So we have some great examples of single-page apps out in the wild. Obviously, big brands, Just Eat, Facebook, Doodle, Twitter, and of course, our favorite CMS of all, Umbraco. Now, the first question is, people ask, why use an SPA as opposed to creating just a vanilla MVC website? And there are a few reasons. You get a consistent user experience across desktop, mobile, and tablet, especially when you're using a framework such as Foundation or Bootstrap. You also get partially connected client functionality. The improvements to the HTML5 API, such as offline storage, web workers, and various other things, mean that you can still provide a rich client experience without having Wi-Fi connection, 3G connection, while you're sat in the tube, commuting in and out of Oxford Circus, as some of you may horribly have to do. In short, you get data-rich apps across a modern and diverse web platform. They're cross-platform compatible, they work on a multitude of devices, and they give your audience the best possible, they give you the best possible reach to your audience. So, now here comes the kicker. Why not SPA? And this talk revolves around a particular discussion I had with a guy called John Papa, who's a Microsoft MVP, and he currently works for Disney in Florida. And he came out with a framework called the Hot Towel Spa, points for punny naming. And someone asked him when it would be not conducive to use this design pattern. And there's a link which is part of the slides that will go up on GitHub a little later. But I'll quote him. One example would be a website, lots of static data for presentation in regions or areas. This could be done with client-side templating, but then you lose a lot of SEO, and websites are often where SEO is important. In contrast, a single-page app for a banking app is not a place you'd want SEO, obviously, as AT&T, I think, discovered with their iPad app. So there are two examples, websites and any place you need SEO. There are ways to do it, but it's not a natural fit, was his argument. And so my response to that was quite simple. Twitter. Twitter is an SPA. Twitter is a prime example of an SPA. It runs off an entire API on the back office. You can open it up in a web browser and still read a set of tweets that are cached offline using HTML5 mechanisms. So, and yet they still manage to achieve SEO. You can still type in usernames, tweets into Google and still come up with full HTML content delivered. So how do we go about doing this kind of thing with the modern tools, such as AngularJS, Knockout, Ember, React, Backbone? I believe there's a drinking game, which is if you come up with a noun, Google noun.js, and if it exists, you take a shot. So this is a talk about how to do SPAs with SEO. So we're going to be approaching this from a vanilla ASP.NET MVC website, and then putting on top of that an MVVM JavaScript framework. And if anybody says to me that Angular is MVC, not MVVM, we'll talk about it afterwards. But the idea is being able to share common elements between your server and your client, because they're the same design, they are similar design patterns. And so the theory stands that you should be able to reuse, the dry principle says that you should be able to reuse some of that code wherever possible. So the idea being is that you can take your MVC views and expose those as JavaScript MVVM partials or complete pages. You can take your roots from ASP.NET and you can export those into a JavaScript routing library, whether that's Angular, whether it's Durandal and you're using it with Knockout. And JS views can have optional model bindings, so you can then extend the SPA experience. The ultimate exercise here is to try and deliver a progressive SPA, because the whole point of the web is to deliver content. Instead of delivering a shell, which is an empty web page, plus 20 meg of JavaScript, plus another 5 meg of API requests, just to get a couple of lines of text and an image. Our job is to deliver content to people in the quickest and easiest way possible. So, and this hopefully gives you some idea of how to take the two approaches and mix them together so that you can build yourself a site that's accessible, it's relatively easy to build, and it uses all the latest shiny tools that you've got out of the box, and it allows you to progressively upgrade the experience based on client capability. So without further ado, let's talk about AMD. which is a standard way of writing JavaScript modules. Has anybody heard of AMD previously? A couple of people. Okay, so for those who don't know, AMD is effectively a way of writing JavaScript modules so that they can be dependency injected. Anybody heard of Require.js? Okay, how many people here have worked with Angular a huge amount? Quite a lot. Okay, so for those that don't know, JavaScript's come quite a long way since the old days of the browser wars where we had to write 2 lots of code from Netscape and Internet Explorer. We can now write modules which can have dependencies on other functionality, and they can be asynchronously loaded and then executed as all the dependencies are completely loaded. So an AMD literally stands for asynchronous module dependency. So, asynchronous module definition. And it's a standard format for dependency injection in JavaScript. Require.js follows the AMD pattern. I believe Mozilla has been working on ratifying a standard around AMD so that frameworks can you can effectively write a JavaScript library without having to use something like Require.js, and it will automatically pull in the necessary dependencies from your other files. Basically, file-based JavaScript dependency. So dependencies tend to be loaded into a constructor for asynchronously, and then the constructor is invoked only when all the dependencies are loaded. So if you've got slow bandwidth, that's okay. Your code's not going to get run before it's ready. You don't end up with nasty race conditions or anything. So, and then finally, the constructor for your JavaScript function, your JavaScript module, returns your view model, which is what we then use to bind to a view in Angular.js. So, Angular or Knockout? So I saw who'd worked with Angular. Has anybody worked with Knockout as well? Okay, few people. So, Angular.js and Knockout.js. Now, Knockout.js is very simply a JavaScript model binder. What it does is it takes a JavaScript object and it binds it to HTML. And if you update something in the HTML, if you update an input field in a form, it updates the JavaScript accordingly using something that is called an observable. So Angular has something similar, but it does all the wiring up for you automatically. Knockout requires some configuration. So Angular, you simply just give it an object, bind it, and whenever it changes, it updates automatically. It does the necessary heavy lifting for you. Angular also comes with some extra extensions, as well as simple model binding, taking just an object and binding it to an HTML view. It's also got routing, it's also got data structure, syntax, dependency injection. There's so much it does. But Knockout just does one small part of that. So, and then separate libraries are used to provide extra functionality, such as Durandal for routing and various other bits. So, as mentioned, it turns JSON objects into observable. So, with Angular, simply change the property scope.prop equals the value. So, makes code reusable, neater, and a lot easier to maintain. And it makes event-driven JavaScript. Who's written code like this? Kind of $input.change with a function. Who's written code like this? And this is going in the code confessions later. Right, because every time you do this, a kitten dies. So, and I'm not kidding. Sorry? Murderer. Absolute murderer. I do remember one particular instance working on a contract a couple of years ago where I did take the initiative to rewrite something in the order of several thousand lines of those input.change for all the various events that were being fired around the page just to update a shopping basket, and took the initiative to rewrite the whole thing into Knockout. And the client was like, wow, that's just what we need, is we need something that does all that model binding just automatically. It takes all the ball ache out of having to do your event handling in that kind of way with jQuery and actually having to say, oh, this button does this, and then maybe if that's got that value or whatever. You can actually focus on real business logic rather than having to worry about the way the UI is handling it. Knockout and Angular do that all for you. So now we move on to Breeze.js. Now, Breeze is a really cool tool, which I was singing its praises outside a little earlier, but I'll tell you about what it is now. Breeze is link for web API with JSON. So if you want to write an SPA, if you want to write a single page app and you want to consume data, you know you've got to write an API that exposes that data from your server. You've got to have a DB context, you've got to map it all up and wire it all up. Breeze does that all for you. You simply provide it with your context and you provide it with a method, HTTP GET method, spit out some data, On the other side, the JavaScript side, you simply go, Breeze, get me this controller, this action, and then select where, order by, filter. You've got all sorts of link querying tools in JavaScript to be able to do data manipulation and then turn that into your model ready to bind to your view. So it returns JSON or Atom. Web API returns JSON or Atom compatible XML. So Breeze.js simply makes that data fluently queryable in JavaScript. So linking all the things everywhere. So is everybody kind of caught up with me so far about the various libraries and what they're doing? Anybody lost or anything? Want me to re-clarify anything? No? Fantastic. Excellent. So now we're taking this example. This example uses knockout, breeze, and require. So, however, I am going to show off the Angular version because that one is a lot easier, quite simply. You don't have to worry about all the different libraries. But require.js makes your JavaScript modular. It means that you can write a module, inject different services and dependencies into it, and have all of that managed for you by the JS runtime. Knockout.js takes your model, your object, makes it bindable to your HTML view. So you give it an object, a form, a list, a product list, a shopping basket, whatever, and then you add the appropriate HTML markup, and it just glues the two together. Breeze.js is for getting data really easily out of the server side. So now we've got that, here are our three stacks in terms of building a progressive SPA. We've got our traditional ASP.NET MVC, which is an HTML view and an MVC controller with some actions on it. We then have the SPA side of things, which is an HTML view and a JavaScript view model, which comes from a Web API view, if you will, and a Web API controller. So we're spitting JSON out there, which goes in there, that returns that. So in theory, we've got a view here and a view here. Why can't we share those? Why not? And that's what we're going to do. So now that text is far too small for anybody to read, but that's simply bullet points that explain that. So now we're actually going to go into some code. And I'm really sorry that this is tiny, but I can't work out how to zoom in. Unless anybody knows the shortcut, by any chance? Yep, that's not working for me. Hang on. Yeah, that's not working either. Okay, well, I'll try and walk people through code. If anybody wants to read, all the slides and links and everything are on GitHub, so you can peruse this at pleasure. So, but I'll try and walk you through what this does. So, to start off, we have some core things in this little framework that I've dubbed Roman Spa.
What do you think we're looking at?
Oh, crumbs. That's not what you're meant to be looking at. One second. Why has it not extended? Right, that's better. Let's try that. Whey! Okay, now we've got Visual Studio. You still can't see much. See, that's what I was trying to zoom in on. That's what I was trying to zoom on. However, I will try and walk you through a few bits here. So, yeah, down here, got it. Okay. Whey! Okay. Now, I can't guarantee that all of this will necessarily, because the zoom changes every single time you open a new window. But, okay, so we're going to start off with an abstract class, Roman controller. Now, that is simply just a placeholder for what we're going to do later. Because if we go back to these slides briefly, that bad boy, and now the key thing here is understanding that these, because we want to share these two views have to be accessible at the same URL. So if you've got a home controller, right, and an index action, when I load it, first time, I want to load everything. I want the navigation, I want all the scripts, I want all the style sheets, I want my title, my meta tags, the whole lot. I want my complete payload of a web page to come in here. Then what I want is my JavaScript to kick in and go, oh, actually, I want Angular. What I want is I want it to pick up the route that we've just gone to, the URL, and say, oh, actually, I can now upgrade this to an Angular experience. I can upgrade this to an SPA experience. What I want it to do then is to get, ideally, the same data out of here, maybe different data, but initially the same data. And I want it to take that data and bind it to this view, which is the same view. But I only want this view to be a partial. I want to strip out the navigation. I want to strip out all the other different bits of components, all the other excessive page load stuff. So, and I just want the naked view on its own, at which point I can start to provide an enhanced experience. Now, if I jump back to my code, so I've got this Roman controller, and that's a placeholder because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take every single controller of those and then export all the routes out into JSON so that Angular can pick them up. Because Angular won't work, or Durandal, the routing library, won't work without knowing what those routes are. Okay? Everyone with me so far? Great. So, we then have a base route API controller, and we have an abstract routes. At which point, this is where we do all the lovely shiny reflection stuff, where we go and get all types base type is equivalent to Roman controller. This is where we go and get all the controllers and all the actions on the controllers that we subsequently want to turn into URLs to spit out to Angular or Durandal. Okay? So if you don't understand reflection too much, don't worry, just whatever you do, don't touch that, unless you know what you're doing. So, and then we've got some stuff in here to actually generate the URLs and to spit, and as I say, we have an abstract, so, which is routes. Because I've got two implementations of this, and one of them is Knockout and one of them is Angular. So, after that, we then got an Angular controller, which overrides, and this is where we actually wire it up and we start spitting out the JS routes themselves. And this is what Angular is going to pick up, is it's going to take all those URLs that we've got on the server, all those controllers, all those actions, and it's going to spit them out into Angular so it can pick them up and subsequently go, oh, I recognize that URL. I need to load a JavaScript view. This is where it gets a little bit funky. So, in our app.js, we do a startup bit, and this is where we actually go in and get, yep, I shall, sorry. So, this is where we actually go and get the route table, var populate route table. So what we want to do is make an AJAX request, which goes and gets our Angular routes. And once it's done, it goes and populates the route table. So we also have a nice little function where we can actually preload all the templates up so we can create effectively an offline cache, if you like, to be able to say, right, if I've got Signal, fantastic, go and get me all the views for the app and then save them in local storage so I don't have to have a connection later. This is where we can start turning a website into more of an interactive native app experience. So after we've done that, we then go to our controllers, and we've got, and I'll zoom this again. We have a home controller, which inherits from Roman controller. So by inheriting from that, I'm saying, right, I want to take all those actions and I want to export them. I want to export them to Angular. And yes, I know I'm not using dependency injection because this is a demo. So anything that's decorated with Roman action is going to get spat out to Angular. So my index, my blog post. Now you'll notice there's a couple of parameters in there, and an about page as well. There's a couple of parameters in there because what I also realized was that imagine if you could basically make one request to a URL and do several things with it. First thing, you load up your entire web page with layouts, navigation, styles, JavaScript, the whole kit and caboodle. That's your first request. And your first payload back to the browser is effectively a fully working web page. So Google crawls it, gets your SEO, gets your content, fantastic. First part of the job done. Next part is taking that URL, getting Angular to recognize that URL, which is what was in the app.js, and then adding a couple of extra headers on it and calling the same URL to go get my server-side model and to go get my server-side view as a partial to load into the Angular context. Everyone with me so far? Great. So I've got something which is a factory, so that basically has a single method that will actually go and get some data. I've also specified a JavaScript controller name. So there's a default controller name because Angular, when it goes to a route, it needs two things. It needs a controller, what it calls a controller, which is actually a view model, but that's another argument. It needs a controller and it needs a view. It needs those two things to be able to actually say, oh, I can navigate here and load this up. So I've decided to override it and create a custom controller. And this is where we get into extending functionality to support the fancy HTML5 stuff. Also, maybe I don't want to return my server view. Maybe I want to return a different view. So actually, I've overridden the view location, which spits out an HTML file. So I've added a couple of extra options in there which allow you to effectively say, right, I've got one URL that does effectively three things. One, it delivers a complete web page. Two, it delivers a partial web page for Angular. And three, it delivers a JavaScript model to bind to that view, to bind to the second one. Everyone with me so far? Great. Excellent. And we also decided to put in a couple of partials as well. So these basically can't be called directly by URL. But if Angular wants to call them, by adding this extra header in, the request will be accepted. So you can have JavaScript partials served up by ASP.NET MVC views. And that's kind of cool. So, because there's certain things, I mean, I personally know I've got server-side toolkits by companies like DevExpress and Telerik and things, and you can't just take that stuff and dump it into an HTML file. If you want to still use your server-side views, you should still be able to use your server-side views, and that's exactly what those are for. So, now let's see what this actually looks like in action. Debug, start new instance. That. Bingo. This was loaded with Ajax, check it out, versus the source code of the page. Now I'm going to pull open the view that this comes from. Partials, home, index. I've added an extension method, isRomanViewRequest, which basically checks for a JavaScript, it checks for an HTTP header, which I've manually hacked into the JavaScript request. So, if context is RomanViewRequest, boom, load with Ajax. Otherwise, load some other text. And if I check the source code, there's our content, but that's not the same content. We've successfully delivered up two sets of content. First one for the first page load, second one as a partial. At which point, now we can start to get into the fun stuff where we can start extending things and adding shiny, jazzy effects, if anybody likes those kind of things. So next up, we have, I'm going to go to the blog section. So if I go to the blog, I have a blog listing page that got loaded via Ajax, and now you're also supposed to load. There we go. Okay, it's thinking about loading that image. And again, we've got this bit at the top, but if we go into the source code, we've got this. We don't actually have that heading, which should be appearing about there. So, and if we step through this, this is where we're using Breeze. Right, now I'm going to try and zoom on this as well. Okay. So this is a custom controller which we specified in, when we specified our home controller, we specified that we wanted a different controller name there. And that controller is this one. So there is a generic controller that will handle most requests, which you can inherit from. You can change it up as much as you like. So here we go. Now we create a service name, Breeze/blog API. Now that is the name of our API controller where Breeze is. So if I go to controllers, and this is where Breeze is literally a breeze. I'm sorry, I know it's punny, but you simply add an attribute on here that says Breeze controller. You specify a context provider, which wraps around your entity framework context, and then you simply go HTTP GET context.context.blogposts, and you add this extra, this metadata. Now this is where the schema data gets exposed to Breeze. So what you can do is actually take, Breeze is effectively entity framework for JavaScript. It gives you querying, it also gives you update and change tracking capabilities on your entities. So if you want to create a really data-rich, heavy client experience, Breeze is absolutely bloody fantastic. Honestly, best thing, well, maybe not quite the best thing since sliced bread, but coming close second. So, but it's that easy to basically say, right, I'd like a database, I'd like some posts, and I'd like it in JSON, and that's it. And then querying it is also just as easy. We create new Breeze.entity manager. So we've got blog API, that's the name of our API controller. Breeze.entity query from posts, that's the name of our action. And if I want, I can do this. Dot just like that. Order by post date. So I've got full entity querying, sorting, filtering, you name it. Manager execute query, which returns a promise. Who's familiar with JavaScript promises? Most people, okay. So JavaScript promises is basically, it's a function that says, I will do something, but when I finish doing it, I will return, I will basically call back to another function saying, I've either succeeded, or I've failed, or in either state, I've finished my work, basically. So a promise basically has about 3 states. You can add more, but those are the 3 most commonly used. So execute query returns a promise, and then you go, then, once it's done that, which is the code to run next, we then load our posts up, scope.blogposts, and in our view, we use, and if I go inspect, actually I will load the server-side view. Here we go. Bit big, or is that okay? So, and this is our pure Angular view, simple HTML file, which again we specified in the home controller. We said we wanted to specify a different view path rather than returning a server-side view. So we've got full extensibility about where our data comes from, where our view comes from, how it's populated, when it's populated. And that means we can do some really cool stuff. For example, in here, I believe I did have a bit of code. There we go, store posts offline. If supports local storage, return false, and local storage equals data. So we can simply take all the blog posts that have just been loaded from our API and go, right, we're going to store those offline later. And so when you go back into your browser and you decide to scroll through and go, oh, next page. Oh, wait, you've just cached 50 blog posts. So the code can still run. So you can be sat on the tube reading through your stories with effectively a self-built offline cache. And this is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a progressive SPA, one that delivers content up on the first request, so you still achieve SEO, but one that also allows you to support all the new shiny stuff and all the new features in HTML5 across platforms, and that's pretty much that. Any questions? No?
Thoughts on implementing that within Umbraco?
Sorry?
Thoughts on doing that within Umbraco with Umbraco views?
Challenging. because you would have to effectively, the routing, you'd have to effectively export the XML routing table instead. So what you do is instead, so let's say you've got this abstract-based controller. If I just pull it up. So I've got this Angular controller, and this is what exposes my routes. So this goes and gets the controllers, gets the actions on the controllers, turns it all into a set of JSON objects, which Angular then picks up and says, oh, that's a route, that's a controller, that's a route, that's a controller, and a view. Doing that with Umbraco, you'd have to, instead of doing the get controllers and get actions on controllers, you'd actually have to query the URL structure accordingly, which could be a bit more challenging because you'd then have to add metadata on there for the appropriate controller for each URL and the appropriate view you'd want to load with it. So doable, but not easily, in short. So, any other questions?
What are the security implications of using Breeze versus HTTP?
If you have concerns about using Breeze, then very simply you can just do this. Let's quit that. It's Web API, basically. So you can use all the same attributes that you're used to in Web API. You can insist on authorization. So obviously, when querying in Breeze, you'd actually have to add your authentication header onto, and there are ways of configuring that within Breeze, so you can actually make an authenticated request to Web API, but you'd have to configure that. So, but it is doable. So from that perspective, there's no real security implications apart from the ones where you basically build a well-designed app. Simply secure your data in the same way you would a regular SPA. Secure your actions on your MVC side in the same way you would a normal website. So. Sorry?
It also supports lazy loading.
The blog post example that I pulled up is in fact lazy loaded. So whilst the views are cached at the beginning, as are the routes and the controllers, the actual data, I believe, is lazy loaded. So if I quickly just refresh that. So if I drop that in there, stick a breakpoint on here. Oh, come on, give me a breakpoint. Come on. Okay, so we now have, notice how that looks very empty at the moment, because this right now should be going off to query, I hope. Okay, so that's our server view, gets nulled out, gets loaded with our Angular view. And you're supposed to hit a breakpoint here somewhere. Okay, that does not seem to be showing a breakpoint for some reason. I don't know why. But yeah, the data certainly within the Angular view is lazy loaded. With regards to lazy loading, so when the request leaves the server, it has to be populated. So in that respect, it's not lazy loaded in the sense you're thinking of, which is, oh, it's only going to get loaded when Breeze effectively needs to get access to the properties. So all the properties will be populated the moment they get delivered via the request on Web API. So in that regard, they're not lazy loaded. Okay? So, but in this instance, I've actually gone in and loaded them effectively after I've executed this code effectively after the fact, after the controller's loaded. So I've boosted up a controller first and then gone, right, now I need to go and get some blog posts. Hey presto, go off and call it, wait for the response to come back, and then populate. So, any further questions? Yes?
How do you share between the USC and the Angular one? That part I didn't.
I'm sorry?
The view,
How does the view get shared?
yeah,
Ah, that's a little bit of trickery. So now we have exported. So what we did in the app.js was we exported all the routes from the server side, okay, out into JavaScript. So in here we've now got a JavaScript object that's being fed to Angular, okay, and that's being fed a number of things: controller name, URL for the view, okay, and I think one other thing. What was it? Route pattern controller and template URL. Yeah. So it's fed the URL, the corresponding controller for that URL, and a corresponding view, okay, to load up. Now, when the view is requested, if it's a straight MVC view, okay, the request is going to go through the MVC pipeline, but I've added into, I believe it is, here we go, yes, up here, X Roman view request. This is a header that's added on top of the view requests whenever Angular is requesting a view. So that header gets added in. I've got an extension method on the server side that says, right, if this header is present, then it sets the value to true, okay? At which point, let's say I'm going to /blog, for example, okay? So I go to /blog, it loads up the full HTML, Angular kicks in, goes, oh, /blog, right, I have to go get the view at /blog, okay? Sends off an AJAX request to /blog with that header on it. So the controller goes, okay, return a view, right? In the views, I've got this, which is context is Roman view request, which simply goes, is that header present? Yes, then load the AJAX, then load the different part. If no, it's a server-side call. So it's being loaded by URL for the first time. It's being loaded cold.
So if you turn up in JavaScript, the page should still work, isn't it?
Precisely. That is precisely the point behind this. If you switch off JavaScript, you still get content. So Google can still crawl it. People who have accessibility needs can still crawl it. You're effectively providing a progressive SPA. So rather than doing backwards hacks, which is trying to create static images cached on your server to serve up to Google when you detect a particular user agent. So, because there are node modules that do that, and it's a really horrible hack. It's a backwards way of approaching the problem. We should be approaching the problem by delivering content first and upgrading the experience for those who can support it second. That's our job. It's to deliver content on the web. It's what it was invented for.
You're always executed to request every page and directly rail.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
You're requesting the page twice, one through Angular, sometimes through the
One through cold and one through Angular, yes. So you effectively, sorry? The way I've coded this at the moment is when you boot it up, it actually requests all the views in the root and caches them. So it's effectively preloading all the views. Okay? However, it can lazy load them. So yes, in essence, what you're doing is when you hit, let's say you hit /home, okay, and Angular kicks in and goes, right, I need to load the Angular view. Boom, it loads up the Angular view. Okay? When you go to /blog, however, the Angular routing engine's already kicked in at that point. So then it will go and only load /blog. It won't do a full page request. Right? It'll just do a partial by navigation, and it will only load the Angular view for blog. Does that make sense? So it's only on first load that you get a double hit, basically.
So in your views there, are you able to have sort of an act variable for the server-side thing and an NV binding?
Yeah, that's the point. That's precisely the point. And I will... Sorry? So yeah, I started working on this a couple of years ago. So it's taken a while to kind of be refined into such an extent. But yeah, now it's kind of framework ready. I do plan on sticking it on NuGet at some point when I can be asked to write the new specs. But otherwise, it's on GitHub for anybody to have a play with. So, and I think that's fine. Thank you very much, folks. Absolute pleasure.